right, guys, welcome back to the Public Land Sportsman. I'm Justin Hawkins. Today, we're going to get into something that has really been a big part of my hunting this year, and that's overlooked spots. It's a term that you've heard the last 4 or 5 years. It's getting more and more brought up in mainstream hunting conversations. 10, 15 years ago, hunting was a lot different. The landscape of hunting looked a lot different. Private land was a lot more accessible. You know, you could get access with a handshake, you know, a friend of a friend, your neighbor, something like that. Well, over time, things have changed. And in return, that has also changed public land hunting and the way we hunt public land. But an overlooked spot back in the 90s, that was a spot that was remote, that was kind of a long ways away from the road, or it was a real hard place to get into. And guys just didn't go there because they didn't have to. You know, not every guy was out trying to kill a Boone and Crockett buck. They just wanted to kill a nice rack buck every year, so they could go to the same stand locations and accomplish that. They didn't have to go a mile out into the middle of the swamp to kill a nice buck. Well, as private land access lessened, as you know, access was cut off, and a lot of it vanished overnight with consolidations and land corporations, things like that. That pushed a lot more people onto public land. So public land absorbed all the extra pressure. So back then, that's what the overlooked spot was, this remote swamp or this big, thick briar kudzu patch off the side of the highway. And as that changed, what public land has turned into more of now is it's an overlooked spot that gets used for just a period of time throughout the season. That's kind of how I've started to use the term, and the things I'm doing, how it associates with how I hunt, or how it relates to how I hunt. You guys like my little microphone? So anyways, this year, for instance, my main goal was to kill a buck in an overlooked spot with my bow. Kill a mature buck in an overlooked spot with my bow. And get it all on video. And when I say overlooked spot, I'm talking something that is extremely overlooked. So, for instance, this year, when I shot my buck, from the tree I was in, I could see the DNR truck parked in the headquarters parking lot. And that spot's overlooked because parking lot's right there. Headquarters is right there. You know, people are going to think everyone goes there and everyone uses it. Now, there was a lot of unique things that were going on this year that made this spot the way it was. And that's more stuff I'll get into later on in this video, but that's all as you collect knowledge and you collect information over the years, you put it all together. You know, every little piece of information you have is a tool. And once you gather that information, you take that tool and you set it in your toolbox. And as you progress through your hunting career, you're going to run into situations where you see a piece of sign, you see a trail, but you're not seeing the trail anymore. You're seeing the way the trail's being used as far as the number of tracks or how fresh the tracks are. Even whether there's mud on the side from them moving over, like there's a lot of information that comes into hunting, and it's deciphering that information and it's decoding all that information and using it to the best of your ability. And one day it's just going to click. It's just, you're going to take a piece of information and you're going to make a decision based on what you saw, and everything's going to work out for you. And it's going to be a fluid moment. It's going to be a day where you remember everything going the way you wanted it to go. You got up the tree quietly. You drew your bow smoothly. You know, you're not always going to get comfortable draws or draws under the best conditions, but you can still draw your bow smooth and feel everything about the moment, I guess. And that's kind of the pretty hippie thing to say, but in essence, that's kind of what you're doing. And everything's going to move fluid, and it's a real special moment when all of that happens. And it kind of gives you a deeper understanding of hunting and what we're out here doing this for. You know, some of us, a lot of us. And that's what I want to pass along to you today. I want to break down the origins of the overlooked spot, what has led to this, what has led to the conditions that we have now, and how it's shaped public land hunting, and what I think this means for the future. And this isn't a fear tactic video or whatever they call it. This is just me being honest, what I see, and how I think we should approach it. Hunting's gonna change without a doubt. No matter what we do, something about hunting's gonna change. And my generation is in a unique position because we're the only generation to grow up in an analog world and mature in a digital boom, a digital society. And we've seen that whole transgression, that whole evolution of things that have happened. And we of all people should know to expect change. Live for the moment, hunt in the present, but be looking ahead and be ready for what's coming down the line. So with that being said, we're going to get into it. Look, I got some books on Amazon if you guys want to learn more about hunting mature public land bucks. It's my take on things, how I think you should approach hunting public land these days, and I think you guys will enjoy it. It gives me an opportunity to get out, get more content, and bring more content out there to the world. I'm a carpenter, so every little bit helps. So thank you guys. Let's get into the video. In the 1990s, private land access via leases grew significantly, indicating fewer completely free access options. When the private land access becomes fewer or more expensive, hunters disproportionately shift toward public land, and this shift accounts for approximately 5% of total U.S. hunting days. And even when private land was more accessible, a significant portion of hunting activity depended on public land. But the public land also has its limitations. It could not absorb all the pressure. Private lands remain the dominant place for hunting overall. However, there are hunters that often hunt public and private, but to fill in the gaps, when the private land isn't available, they hunt public. Farmland at the outskirts of towns and cities was sold to developers, and rural landscapes that had remained largely intact for generations began to fragment. Small forests, hedgerows, and woodlots, once the foundation of local deer habitat, were cleared for housing, shopping centers, and roads. For hunters, these changes had immediate implications. Private land that had long been accessible through tradition, handshake agreements, or family inheritance was disappearing. Farms consolidated or were sold, liability concerns intensified, and trust-based access became more challenging to maintain. This early suburban sprawl began to push hunters toward public parcels, which provided the only reliable access to hunt. Deer, in contrast, were already adapting to these changes. Fragmentation created edge habitats like fields, hedgerows, and small patches of timber, which whitetails quickly exploited. These transitional areas provided food and cover, allowing deer to coexist closer to human activity. The first signs of what would later be called urban deer were emerging. Animals capable of navigating roads, subdivisions, and scattered human presence with remarkable adaptability. Public land gained new significance. Even in the 1980s, accessible, contiguous, and protected parcels became refuges for both deer and hunter. Early conservation programs recognized the need for careful management of deer populations as rural landscapes gave way to suburban sprawl. In essence, the 1980s set the stage for decades to come. Economic growth and suburban development began fragmenting habitats, reducing private access, and concentrating pressure on public land. For hunters, understanding these early shifts is crucial because the patterns established then still shape where and how we hunt mature bucks today. Hunters displaced from private acreage turned to state forest, wildlife areas, and other public parcels. These areas, which had once experienced intermittent use, now face consistent pressure. Parking lots filled, trails were worn, and entry points became predictable. Even without a significant increase in the overall number of hunters, public land became the preferred option, with activity concentrated in areas that private farmlands once absorbed. For deer, the consequences were evident. Traditional patterns in farm fields and along hedgerows were disrupted. Animals that once relied on quiet private land began retreating to remaining cover, including woodlots, wetlands, and a few remaining public parcels. Mature bucks became more difficult to encounter, and the era of predictable traditional hunting began to fade. The rapid loss of farmland access in the 1980s did not only reduce opportunities, but also reshape the landscape, the hunt, and the deer themselves, setting the stage for the pressures and adaptations that define public land hunting today. 1980s saw farmers pushing for greater efficiency and productivity, and one of the most transformative changes in rural landscape was the expansion of drainage systems. Tile lines were laid deeper and farther, and ditches were widened, and the wetlands that had persisted for decades were drained to allow for more consistent crop production. This change had several significant consequences for hunting and wildlife. The loss of wetland habitat, seasonal ponds, and marshy lowlands, and intermittent streams had served as crucial bedding, feeding, and travel areas for deer. However, when these areas were drained, deer lost their natural refuge, which had historically provided safety from hunters and predators. Simplified landscape drainage resulted in open, uniform fields, reducing natural cover and forcing deer to depend on smaller, more isolated pockets of timber or brush. The complexity of the landscape, which once offered numerous escape routes and travel corridors, was significantly diminished. With wetlands eliminated and fields becoming more open, the few remaining areas of cover became attractive to both deer and hunters. Public parcels, woodlots, and riparian strips that were not drained experienced increasing hunting pressure as displaced deer concentrated there. Deer adapted by shifting to microcover. In summary, the drainage expansion did not merely increase crop yields, it reshaped the hunting landscape. It reduced cover, funneled deer into predictable pockets, and amplified pressure on public land. Combined with farm consolidation, fence line removal, and woodlot fragmentation, it created a hunting environment that necessitated adaptation, observation, and strategy beyond what had been previously encountered. White-tailed deer shifted from large forests to edge cover. By the 1980s, cumulative efforts of farmland consolidation, woodlot fragmentation, fence line removal, and drainage expansion had begun to reshape the world of the white-tailed deer. Large continuous forests, the interior timber where deer once felt safest, was shrinking. What had once been secure, low-pressure habitat had transformed into a patchwork of open fields, isolated woodlots, and fragmented cover. White-tailed deer demonstrated remarkable adaptability to these changes. Instead of retreating entirely, they shifted to the periphery of their environment. Field boundaries, brush strips, hedgerows, small woodlots, creek corridors, and drainage ditches became the new habitat for mature bucks and does. Edge cover provided the balance deer required: access to food in open fields, and protection in the surrounding area. The shift had immediate implications for hunters. Traditional strategies, such as hunting deep timber or relying on established travel patterns through continuous forests, became less effective. Deer were no longer predictable in large forests. Instead, they moved along margins, small cover pockets, and transitional terrain, necessitating hunters to reconsider stand placement, timing, and scouting techniques. Public land gained increased significance as private farmland and traditional cover diminished. Deer increasingly concentrated in the remaining accessible patches, particularly state forests, wildlife areas, and other public parcels. Hunters relying on these areas faced heightened competition and pressure, and success depended more on observation, patience, and understanding of the edge dynamics than on inherited knowledge. In essence, the shift from forest interior to edge cover in the 1980s fundamentally transformed the hunting experience. Deer became more adaptable, cautious, and pattern-driven, while hunters had to adjust to a landscape where opportunities were concentrated and predictable habitats were scarce. This adaptation laid the foundation for modern public land hunting, where edge cover tactics remains crucial for encountering mature bucks. By the 1980s, white-tailed deer were no longer confined to remote forests. The combined effects of farmland loss, woodlot fragmentation, fence line removal, and drainage expansion pushed deer into closer contact with people and human activity. Bucks and does began exhibiting what biologists now refer to as early adaptation to human presence. They learned to navigate landscapes dominated by roads, farms, equipment, homes, and hunters. For hunters of that era, that presented both challenges and opportunities. Increased wariness in traditional hunting spots. Deer in areas near roads, farmlands, or regularly used public parcels began adjusting their daily routines. Bucks that were once predictable on edges of field borders became more cautious, moving at different times of day or avoiding obvious paths. Stand placement that had been effective for decades suddenly resulted in fewer sightings and encounters. Deer sought refuge in microcover, small patches of brush, creek bottoms, drainage ditches, and edge habitats that received little human traffic. Mature bucks in particular learned to remain out of sight, forcing hunters to reconsider their strategy. Success often required more scouting, patience, and innovative stand placement. As private farmland access declined, deer that were forced onto public parcels had already adapted to human presence. They became less naive, moving cautiously near entry points, along trails, and around frequently used hunting areas. Traditional hunting tactics often thwarted hunters who approached these areas. In essence, early adaptation to human presence in the 1980s rendered hunters incapable of widely relying on inherited knowledge or predictable patterns. Deer were learning from humans, shaping their behavior around human schedules and pressure. For public land hunters, this became a test of observation, patience, and understanding the deer's novel behaviors, a shift that would define modern hunting strategies. Hunters began to observe new phenomenon. Deer were no longer confined to forests, but were increasingly appearing near homes, roads, and suburban boundaries. This marked the early stage of what would later be referred to as the modern urban deer. For the average hunter at the time, this manifested as mature bucks and does were observed feeding in farmyards, orchard edges, and small town peripheries. Deer that previously avoided human structures entirely were now discreetly browsing along fence lines, creek corridors, and overgrown lot edges, seemingly indifferent to occasional human activity. These deer exhibited heightened caution, observation, and intelligence. Hunters quickly realized that strategies employed in deep woods, such as calling, still hunting through extensive timber, or ambushing a trail, were often less effective near homes or roads. Bucks adapted to human schedules, feeding at dawn or dusk, seeking that most concealed cover, and traveling routes that minimized detection. Hunters no longer assumed all deer were wild or naive. Deer near towns and suburban edges were calculated, wary, and opportunistic, teaching hunters early lessons in understanding human-adapted deer. The challenge shifted from locating deer to comprehending their intelligence and routines. Suburban deer populations thrived in and around human activity, making public land the sole location where hunters could interact with these more intelligent and cautious animals without trespassing. Public parcels became crucial as hunting grounds and refuges for the rapidly urbanizing whitetail population. The urban deer phenomenon was not yet a nationwide issue. It was localized, subtle, and often frustrating. Bucks were not easier to hunt. They were learning from humans and adapting on the fly, laying the foundation for the ongoing challenge of public land hunting. Private farmland access was rapidly diminishing. Public land, however, remained intact: state forests and wildlife areas. State forests, wildlife areas, and other public parcels could not be sold, subdivided, or converted into farmland. As private opportunities vanished, public land became the preferred option for hunters, absorbing the overflow of displaced activity. Even smaller tracts began experiencing increased pressure. Trails that had once been lightly used now carried constant traffic. Parking areas became congested, and entry points became predictable. And for deer, public land provided relative stability. Although not entirely untouched, these areas offered cover, food, and fewer surprises in terms of human disturbance. Edge habitat, timber patches, wetlands, and floodplain corridors within public land became refuges where mature bucks could survive despite the increasing pressure elsewhere. Hunters observed a significant shift in hunting strategies. Success in hunting deer under pressure necessitated development of pattern recognition skills. Public parcels, which were previously considered convenient, became essential hunting grounds. Hunters without access in these areas faced challenges in locating mature bucks. Conversely, those willing to invest time on public land were rewarded with the opportunity to hunt in areas crucial for deer survival. In summary, the 1980s marked a pivotal shift in hunting practice. Public land emerged as a sanctuary for deer, providing cover and enabling survival amidst the shrinking private landscape. Hunters redirected their focus from private farmland to state forest and wildlife areas, and public land became the stage for the development of innovative hunting strategies, including patterning edge cover, scouting micro cover, and tracking human-adapted deer. The early concentration of hunters and deer on public land laid the foundation for the modern public land hunting system, where knowledge, patience, and adaptability are key to success. Early discussions on antler restrictions took place. By the 1980s, whitetail populations in Indiana and much of the Midwest had largely recovered from the population low experienced in the mid-20th century. However, the landscape had undergone significant changes. Hunters were now concentrated on fewer parcels of land, both public and private. While deer were adapting to human presence, wildlife managers recognized that traditional approaches, such as simply opening seasons and setting bag limits, was insignificant to ensure the health of populations, mature bucks, and sustainable hunting. Whitetail restoration had shifted towards regulation. The focus was no longer solely on reintroducing deer to the land, It was now on managing herd structures, age distribution, and population health. Biologists and state agencies began analyzing harvest data, population surveys, and habitat availability. They recognized that overharvesting of young bucks was a growing concern, particularly on public land where hunters were concentrated and pressure was higher. This led to early discussions about antler restrictions, and in the 1980s, these conversations were cautious and exploratory. Managers emphasized that restrictions were not intended to create trophy herds for prestige. The objective was population balance, allowing bucks to reach maturity and contribute genetically to the herd. Some states and districts considered regulations such as must have 3 points on one side or minimum spread restrictions. Discussions often revolved around feasibility, enforcement, and hunter acceptance. Hunters in the 1980s were accustomed to unrestricted antler harvests, so wildlife agencies had to educate the public about the reasons behind protecting younger bucks and how it could enhance long-term hunting quality. These conversations were often local and required outreach through newsletters, meetings, and media. Even at the early stage, managers were collecting harvest records, age estimates, and field observations to evaluate the potential impact of antler restrictions. This laid the groundwork for modern, science-based whitetail management. While these discussions were mostly in the background for hunters, their implications were already evident. Regulations were beginning to consider deer behavior, population dynamics, and public land pressure. Mature bucks were becoming increasingly rare on overpressured parcels, and early antler discussions hinted at a future where sustainable hunting would require patience and strategy. In essence, the 1980s established the foundation for contemporary management practices. Deer populations were experiencing a resurgence, hunters were primarily utilizing public land, and wildlife agencies were adopting scientific approaches to protect mature public land bucks. This ensured the coexistence of both deer and hunters, despite diminishing private access and escalating landscapes and pressure. The implications for the public land buck hunter today. For contemporary hunters, history is not abstract. It directly impacts their experiences. The landscape they traverse is a product of decades of transformation. Private access has declined, small woodlots have become fragmented, drainage systems have expanded, and fences have been removed. Public parcels no longer serve as secluded refuge. They are heavily pressured, highly visible, and accessible to anyone capable of reaching them. Deer have evolved significantly in intelligence. Mature bucks have developed patterns, adapted to human schedules, and have adapted survival strategies to make them more elusive. They exploit microcover, wetlands, and overlooked terrain pockets. Consequently, the likelihood of encountering a large buck in the initial stand attempted has diminished. Success on public land today isn't solely dependent on chance. It demands a profound understanding of pressure dynamics and the adaptability to adapt hunting strategies accordingly. This involves recognizing the dynamic nature of the land. Areas that were once safe may now be overcrowded. Bucks are constantly modifying their routines in response to human activity, weather conditions, and even climate trends. Conservation and management practices have also undergone significant changes. Public land is not an unlimited resource. Maintenance efforts lag behind usage, and ethical hunting pressures directly impact deer populations. Comprehending hunting regulations, adhering to access guidelines, and preserving cover are not merely responsible actions. They are essential for the long-term sustainability of the resource upon which hunters depend. Ultimately, the public land hunter must combine patience, observation, and adaptability. Knowledge is the key advantage. Understanding how deer respond to pressure, how terrain directs movement, and how human patterns influence behavior provides a realistic opportunity to encounter mature bucks. The landscape is evolved, the deer have evolved, and your strategy must evolve with it. In essence, success on public land now hinges less on raw opportunity and more on intelligence, timing, and respect for the land and its wildlife. The hunt is no longer merely a tradition. It is transformed into a game of adaptation for both the hunter and the deer. Look, thank you guys for watching. If you guys want to know more about hunting mature bucks on public land, check out the links in the description below. I have some books for sale on Amazon I think you'll love. I have a new one that just dropped and I am really happy with it. It's some real up-to-date information that should help you next season. So thank you guys again. God bless. I'm out. Peace.